the name of our first speaker tonight is also Sara. Her full name is Sara Louise Muhr, and as Augusta says, she's a professor here at CBS, where we're live streaming from tonight. Sara's research focuses on leadership with a focus on diversity and modern ways of working. And since January 2018, Sara has also held the position as an academic director of the CBS Business in Society platform, Diversity and Differences. And then Sara has also written several published books. We have looked much forward to having you here tonight and hearing your perspectives based on your research. The word is yours.
So thank you for the presentation. I am Sara Louise Muhr, and yes, you have me up there. And I'm professor at CBS, as was mentioned. I will speak mainly today about my research, but I understand that we will take questions together afterwards, and I'll of course be more than happy to also answer any questions relating to my own career, etc. I might need to know whether it's live streamed or taped. But live streamed, but not taped and distributed. So there's a slight difference there. But I would like to, of course, answer any questions afterwards. So I would like to start with the fact that equality is, of course, a very Danish, a very Nordic value that we value very much in Danish organizations. And it doesn't matter. But if we look at the numbers, it was earlier said that we're number 102 on World Economic Forum's list, that is when it comes to women in power positions. So it's something that we value very deeply, but if we look at our numbers, we have a far, far way to go. So for example, we have 7% female CEOs of the Danish Danish private organizations. And I'm not an economist, I don't do math, but I can calculate that is a lot of men in charge of our businesses out there. The second one up here is that we have 6% females as chairmen of the boards, chairpersons we could say, which means that most of our organizations in Denmark are not run by women. We also know that in the 1,200 largest organizations in Denmark, in over half of them, there is not one single woman on the board. I'm just going to let that rest for a second. There's not one single woman on the board of more than half of Denmark's 1,200 largest organizations. That is, for me, not acceptable for many reasons that I will talk about today. So the next one is that we have about 14% women in so-called C-suite. C-suite is CXO, so a director of some sort. And that is, of course, a number that varies because it depends on how you define C-suite or not. But about 14%. We say about 30% female managers overall. So very few women in the top of Danish organizations. We have a 16% pay gap, gender pay gap. That means that men earn 16% more than women do. Some people would argue, well, we have to take into consideration that different industries pay better. We have to take into consideration such as subjects. But what I usually say to people when I work with organizations, I ask them, what's your most important resource? What do people usually say? They say, our people. Okay? Why is it then that one of the greatest reasons for this gender pay gap is that if you look at the HR director and the finance director, I will just ask a rhetorical question. Who do you think earns most? Okay? We have a 30% gender pay gap when it comes to CEOs and directors. 30%. Then people are saying, but it's only the old people. It's different with the young people. But Jeff made an analysis a couple of years ago, and I'm sorry to say it, now it's mostly kind of women in the audience here, but when you're shipped out of the door from CBS or KU, you earn, on average, 6.6% less in your first job. That's not okay. Okay? That is not okay. So, those are some of the numbers that we have and that we have to consider. We also have to consider the rising amount of sexism and sexual harassment in the workplaces, which has exploded a little late in Denmark, or not the sexual harassment itself, but the acknowledgement of the fact that it goes on everywhere. Okay? So we have a lot of issues that we have to deal with, and we're not there yet. So I generally work with, now I can't even use my fingers, 3. I have a clicker in one hand and a microphone in the other one. 3 myths that I really would like you to bust. One is the myth of equality, and I think we can all agree, at least in this room, that that is a myth. We do not have equality, not even in the Danish society. There is the myth of free choice. That's the one I love to discuss, especially with politicians and other people. But the myth of free choice, women choose differently. Okay? We have to consider, and after my talk today, I think that you have to consider, all of you, the fact that our choices are always already embedded in gendered, raised, classed, aged, sexualized, etc. norms of society. Our choices are not independent on what other people think of us. Never. So, what are the usual explanations? I was mentioning one of them before. So what are the usual explanations I always hear? I hear 2 things. One of them, women do not have the competences. And I hope you can hear the irony already beginning here. Women do not have the competencies, meaning they don't take the right educations. They don't have strategic thinking enough. They're not competitive enough. They don't know math enough. Once I even heard the explanation like, well, already in the fetus stage, boys just develop preferences for finance. So we can't do anything about this. Okay? I'm happy it's not taped, only streamed. The next one is that women don't want to. And this is back to my choice. Okay? I hear that all the time. Women choose differently. They choose family over career. They choose not to want careers. That is, of course, to a certain degree correct, but we have to consider how this choice is formed. And some of my data I bring with me today will show you some of the reasons why. Of course, there are also women who do not have the competencies. There are many men who do not have the competencies as well. Okay? So the third myth is the myth of meritocracy. We do not have a meritocracy where necessarily the most competent get to the top. Because we cannot, as I will show you later, evaluate people only based on competencies. It is not human possible. We need help. So, there is also a third one that I would like to consider. And when I work with organizations, I usually tell them, those 2 other explanations, we put them over here in the corner, and if anyone say them in my room, they can go out and drink beer instead of discuss diversity with me. Because we don't get anywhere if you don't think women don't have the competencies, and if you think that women don't want to. If that's valid explanations in our organizations, we can just as well stop doing this. So the third one, maybe, possibly, women and also other minorities are prohibited by gendered or raised or classed, sexualized, etc. power structures, stereotypes, and biases. And of course I don't mean maybe, because this is what I will focus on for the rest of this talk, with very cramped fingers. So, research here is absolutely clear, okay? There is, of course, always one study that shows something else, but I can show you 3,000 that shows this. And on my last slides, if you want to distribute them, you're more than welcome to. I have tons of references to this research. But first of all, I can't see my slides here because they're minimal on the screen. So I have to turn around once in a while. Doesn't matter, I'll figure it out. So first of all, research is very, very clear on the fact that women and other minorities are consistently evaluated as less competent than men. There are many studies that shows this. The most famous one is the so-called CV study. So the CV study, where a huge amount of CVs are sent out to a huge amount of people, there is only one tiny little difference on these CVs. Half of them has a female name, half of them has a male name. The studies come back consistently. People, both men and women, by the way, both men and women judge the male version of the CV to be more competent. They would give him a higher starting salary. They were also more likely to mentor him because they see more potential in him. And particularly in a Scandinavian context, it's really interesting that the female version is less likable. And if I do this, you smile, if I do this to an audience of managers and leaders, many of the women smile exactly like Anya does, because they know exactly what I'm talking about. Once women, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to bust your dreams here, I'm going to get back on a more positive note later, I promise. But a lot of women, when they seek career, they're seen as too masculine, too tough, too bossy. A famous person that we wouldn't want to be so famous would say nasty. So we're seen as nasty, we're seen as too tough, we're seen as bossy, we're seen as bitches, etc. Okay? We're not as likable as the guys. Sorry. What I also want to mention here is that particularly the first studies, if you include a non-Western sounding name on these CVs, the effect is even worse. Okay? So my point here is we simply cannot, none of us, judge people just based on competencies. The worst sentence I know is when people tell me, I've done this for 40 years, I can do this based on my experience. And I usually say, no, that's exactly the reason why you cannot. Actually, I would trust one of you much more than one that's done it for 30 years or 40 years. The next one is that women generally and often get shorter and less praiseworthy letters of recommendations. We know how much letters of recommendations mean. If you need one, tell me. Ask me instead. We know how much letters of recommendations they mean, but we've also seen several studies showing that letters for women are shorter. Different words are used. Even, and this counts for you as well because you're part of this, even in online teaching, okay, where the people or the students think the instructor is a woman. If you don't see the instructor, if they think it's a woman, they get worse evaluations. Exactly the same course if they don't see or hear the teacher. So it is something we have to take into consideration because in all lines of work, this matters. Okay? Because as I will also get back to later, a lot of people, they are hired based on network, based on recommendations, and we need to stop that. I was part of a talk the other day for a group of politicians to promote the fact that we might actually advertise our positions instead of giving them away through our networks. I know it's really radical in the Danish context, but it is kind of the alternative to quotas. Okay? So even asking for positions to be advertised is seen as radical. The next thing we have to remember if we ever are to, one, get any way with this agenda, and second of all, include everyone in it, is the fact that the same thing is exactly, same thing, just opposite, is exactly the same. So a lot of the men that I interview, they experience bullying, teasing, control, etc. when it comes to, for example, asking for paternity leave, when it comes to asking for reduced time, when it comes to choosing different career paths, and when it comes to choosing, for example, caregiving professions. So it is exactly the same opposite. I have only received a shitstorm once from the Danish media, and that was when I had the nerve to say that some of the men in my interviews, they actually break down and cry and tell me, I wish I could get out of this career prison. I wish I was a woman. I wish I was sick so I could get out of this job. Okay? Because it is just as difficult for a man on a career path with everything going for him, to say, I want to take care of the kids for a while. That is also very difficult. I know it's changing with the younger generations, but something happens when you hit the institutions. I have a little exercise I give my MBA students, so my executive MBA students. I have a course in strategic human resource management, and these are all leaders, and I give them an exercise where I get them to discuss in groups how they would handle an employee who asks for reduced time. So there's a little story where this employee is saying, I have third kid on the way, I'm very busy, I would like to have reduced time, I think it's important that I'm home, all of these things. And you can probably guess what I do. In half of the groups, there's a female name. In half of the groups, there is a male name. It is so interesting how this comes back. If they think they're giving career counseling to a man, their first answer is usually, is he bored? Does he need a raise? Should we, give him a course? Does he need to kind of have more competences? Can we somehow make this job more interesting to him? Okay? If it's a woman, the response is more, is really, 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 we're very sad to see you go. We really need you here, but we totally understand it. We will, make some kind of flexible solution for you. We will also make sure we can integrate you into the workforce afterwards. Da-da-da-da. Okay? Of course, the second response should have been given to the male as well, but it quite often isn't. Good. So why is this? And by the way, I don't have the time. Why is this? Well, we look at explicit biases and implicit biases. And the difference here is quite important. It's also important that I write implicit and not unconscious, because unconscious bias is implicit bias you're not aware of. Okay? Implicit bias if you are aware of there are certain automatic things. I'll get back to the details. So the explicit bias, that's the biases that we are aware of. We can measure them. So in an organization, we can also send out a questionnaire. In Denmark, we can send out a questionnaire and ask people's opinions about quotas, for example, just to mention a fun little one. We can also ask people in an organization about their attitudes and perceptions of homosexuals in the workplace. We can ask them about different races and ethnicities, etc., so that we know what the explicit attitudes and perceptions are. To give you a little example, we see quite often these explicit attitudes said out loud. And I was at a meeting not so long ago where I was giving a small talk, not a very long one, about diversity and inclusion. And one of the persons in the room raised the hand and he said, but it's obvious that we have so few female professors in Denmark because it's scientifically proven that men are more intelligent than women. That's a very explicit bias, because this person was not a brain researcher or a gender researcher. It was this person's personal belief that this was the case. Okay? So that's an explicit bias. And an explicit bias, we can decide if we want to take that discussion or not. If you see my jacket afterwards, there's a little pin and it says Killjoy in pink. And that's because then you have the decision. If you don't know that term, you need to look it up, feminist killjoy, and read some Sara Ahmed. Anyways, so you can decide in that moment, do I want to be the killjoy? Do I want again to go, okay, let's discuss this one? Or do I want to let it go? It's an explicit bias, and I make the choice of whether I want to go into this discussion or not. The implicit biases are different, okay? Because the implicit biases are automatically triggered when we enter a room. The second I see you, I think something, and I cannot help it. I'm sorry. It can also be positive. So I think something the second I see someone. Everyone does that. It is automatically triggered. And this is so super important because everyone does that. Back to my examples before, everyone does that. I usually say to people, if you're not biased, you're mentally ill. And I'm sorry, I'm not a psychologist either. But it is actually a mental illness to not being able to cope with the world, to not being able to process the world through biases. Because if you walk out the door on the street and you would have to take in every impression that other people give you and process that neutrally, your brains would go bzzz. It's not possible. So that is why there are actually people who are not capable of walking the street because it's too much. Okay? So when people tell you that they're not biased, particularly people who've taken a bias course and then they think they get rid of it, it's like, nah, your brain doesn't work that way. That might mean your explicit bias is low, but your implicit bias has turned unconscious. So, I'm very small here. Where does implicit bias come from? It's very, very important that it's a cognitive bias. Okay? It's a cognitive bias, so it's the way our brains work. I will just emphasize two theories here, and the one is a word I always forget. Oh, God, I'm even getting blind. I'm old. Okay? Information processing shortcuts, I think it says on this tiny slide here. And that is the theory that tells us about how our brains need shortcuts to process information. And the very important thing here, particularly in a leadership context, particularly in a managerial context, is we need that to function as leaders and managers because we're way too busy to process everything. We need to make decisions made on our stomach. We need to make decisions based on, a better word for our stomach is experience in business language. We need that, obviously. So to say that we're not biased is also to say that we're not managers. So my point here is not that we should not be biased, but we need to know exactly where in our decision-making processes that we cannot handle this ourselves and that we make bad decisions. The next one is social categorization theory. I remember that one. So the next one is social categorization theory, and that is the theory that talks about how we need categories, particularly the binary ones, in order to understand the world. So we understand the world in binaries. For example, when we talk about gender, we understand the world through male and female. That is how we are raised. A really good example is the debate about non-binary people right now. Why is it so difficult for people to accept the fact that a person wants to be talked about as they? I know it's difficult to remember, but why should it be a personal offense to me if you feel non-binary? I shouldn't care less. But people care because they are afraid that they will slip, because my language is constructed in a binary way as well, which means it's so difficult for my brain not to say she. Okay? So that might be why. But nothing, it doesn't hurt me a bit to try. But it's such a good example of how our brains work through binaries. So, the problem here is not the categories in themselves. I always get the question, probably not from this audience, but from different audiences. But do you want us all to be the same? No, of course I do not want us all to be the same, and I don't think we're all the same. I have not a single problem with the category woman, as long as people identify as a woman. I have a huge problem with the labels that are attached to that category. So it's not the categories in themselves, it's not the language male, female that's a problem here. It is the values that are attached to, in this context, particularly the feminine, the female. This is also why I usually say, why do we even need the word feminist? I'm going to ask you in the audience here, how many of you identify as feminists? They can't see you on the screen. If you're not raising your hands, you're not listening. Yeah. Okay. So why is that so difficult for some people? And then some people go, yeah, but we can just use the term equality. And I say no, because there's one tiny little difference which is very important, and that is that which is usually discriminated towards are women and the feminine. Okay? So it's also the feminine in men. It's also the feminine in language, etc. That is why There is a difference, and that is why it's important. Good. So, okay, now I get into trouble because now I need to read the citations, but I hope I can do this while also looking at the camera. But I want to show you how some of these stereotypes and biases play out in my data, and I promise you when we talk later I'll be a bit more positive as well, but I use this so that we take this seriously in a Danish context. And I use this because we need to take into consideration how particularly women are being talked about in Danish organizations. We need to talk about that. My data is based on about 150 interviews with CEOs and other CXOs in the companies that back in the days signed a charter for more women in management. Okay? So these are all people who on paper supports diversity and inclusion. I talk about what I call the ballerina problem. In an American context, Jones C. Williams have talked about the tightrope, walking the tightrope. Okay? So the ballerina problem for me is the fact that as a female leader, you have a very, very tight, narrow tightrope to walk. If you are too masculine, you fall because you're a bitch. If you're too feminine, you fall because you're not leadership potential. Okay? So there's a very, very narrow, socially accepted span of behavior. It comes from two discourses which we see in particular leadership theory. One is fix the women, back to the 80s, where women kind of stormed into the workplace, also in the managerial roles, and the saying back then was, oh, but organizations are made by men, for men, occupied by men, etc., etc. So if women are to compete on the same level as men, they need the same competencies. That probably made pretty good sense back then. I hear this still all the time. Show you in a little while. In the 90s, the HR wave. So people would say, hang on a second, women don't need to be fixed. I think the organizations need to be fixed because we have several issues here that call for a softer side of leadership. We should learn from the feminine. What's the problem here still? Femininity is attached to the female body. Women are expected to behave femininely, okay? So it creates these two mutually exclusive discourses. On the one hand, you need to be masculinized to be taken seriously. On the other hand, you're expected to be feminine, because otherwise you're not a woman. And this is where I have to turn around. I'm so sorry. So, first of all, I have a quote here about fix the women, where a manager is saying, it's part of the female DNA. And I get so sick and tired of the biology argument. No, it's not part of our DNA. It's part of the female DNA to doubt oneself. And I can't count how many people have told me that women, per definition, naturally are just more insecure, doubt themselves. Part of the female DNA to doubt oneself, and we have an obligation to do something about that, us great men in the leadership group. Women have to learn to be more assertive. Heard that so many times as well. Be more assertive. Be able to say yes. You mentioned, one of you, salary negotiation. There is a brilliant, by the way, Harvard Business Review article that shows that in salary negotiations, women are actually punished for being assertive. It's like, that's a little much. Do you have to be that bitchy? That's a little demanding. I really like it when you're humble. I had a boss telling me that once. Value the feminine. Women are more empathetic and better listeners. We know that, right? All of us. And I think that will help change the dynamics in the leadership team. So I have so many all-male teams that tell me that if they just get a woman into the room, they will behave better. And what I usually tell them is, that's not gender, that's sexuality. And that's something different and has nothing to do with her competencies. We need something or someone that can pause us, make our decisions a bit more human, so to speak. It does become very tough sometimes. Okay? So we need a sweet woman so we behave better. Seriously. Okay, now, sorry, it's getting late. I'm getting a little ironic here, but I hope you get the point. So, the problem here, the ballerina problem. What happens when you get too masculine? I'm just going to try if I can do it like this. This is super, super, super tiny. So what happens when you get too masculine? So I can't even read this. There's no way. I have to stand with my back to it. We have a female partner. So it's a consulting firm. We have a female, I really have deep respect for many consulting firms, so it wasn't meant that way. But anyway, we have a female partner, and she ticks all the leadership boxes, but she's not a role model. And this is so interesting, because I've heard so many people talk about what's the ideal female role model. Again, she needs to tick everything. Masculine, femininity, assertiveness, sweetness, everything. Okay? But she's not a perfect role model for the other women because she wants the same as the men. Okay? She has no children, no family, she works all the time, she fits the leader role, but she's not a real woman. My God, thank you. Okay? So this is a very good example of this. Next one. It's generally easier for women than men to use their emotions, intuition, understanding, social engagement, and flexibility in relation to sick children and these things. I lose my breath because there's so many things I need to be able to do as a woman. Because it's part of their path. And that is why I think that to come all the way up here in the hierarchy where he is, they have to do some violence on themselves. I quite often hear that. You have to do some violence on yourselves in order to become a leader. My good colleague from US, Karen Ashcraft, has written an excellent article about the glass slipper. So not the glass ceiling, the glass escalator, etc., but the glass slipper, because a profession is like Cinderella's shoe. And if you can't fit into it, if your body doesn't fit it, and that counts for both non-white bodies and female bodies, then you have to cut a toe or a heel. And that looks messy. Okay? So it's a really good article. And he says you have to do some, and when you do some violence on yourselves, when people do violence to themselves, they become unnatural. I mean, so that you begin to think, damn, they're boxy and unnatural. And I have to say this in Danish. Okay? So he said, fy for helvede, hvor de firkantede og unaturlige. He says that on tape about his female colleagues. And we're not talking about someone I just dug up on a construction site. I'm sorry for all the really reflexive construction workers here. But we're talking about a CEO of a major corporation. And we're talking about that he says it in a way that he wants to help women. Okay? Oh, I dropped this. Next one. One more slide of negativity, and then I will move, okay? So, men and women are different from each other, and it's a leadership responsibility to make sure that the women we have perform. That is true. It is his responsibility to make sure they perform. But then he continues, and are themselves. Okay? You have power enough, even though you, in quotation mark, just are a woman. It's, by the way, not the same person saying this. It's the wrong perception that you have to be a man. Just don't. Lad nu være. Okay? So this is, I hear that all the time. Many men, more men than the men themselves. If you ever hear someone say that, or if you say that yourself, stop yourself. Okay? Because yes, I love being a feminine woman, but there should be room for every kind of way of being a woman. Okay? If you look at the women at the top of the Danish business life, I dare you to claim that they are almost more tough than the men are. They are these kind of female men. It almost makes me sick because they're almost over tough. And this one, he says, det er næsten sådan, at det vender sig i en. So he gets physically ill. He gets sick to the stomach by looking at these women. Good. I think that I am running a little, not out of time, but I need to also turn it to a positive note. So I will quickly go. Oh, I didn't even have those slides. I was about to say I would quickly kind of pass the next slides, but I was actually aware of this beforehand that I wouldn't have time for it. So my point here is that we need to turn the business case argument upside down. And by that I mean so many people value the feminine argument in order to get more women into top management. Okay? We need more women because they can do something else. We need more women because they're softer. We need more women because they have different skills. We need more women because, the other one is sexuality, you know that already, because they do a difference to the team. Okay? That's not the case. We know that diverse teams perform better, but it's not because a minority of any kind will add something different. Okay? It is because we know that in a diverse team, there are more ways of being a woman. So if you have a group of men and one woman, it's often very limited how you can perform femininity. If we have a more diverse team, there are more sides of yourself that you can tap into, also the men. Okay? So my point here, and my mission in both my academic and my speaking life, my consulting life, whatever, is to take that little tightrope, which, by the way, also counts for the men. They just have a plank, so they can move a little to the sides, not too much. I want to make it into a motorway, okay? Because from a human resource management perspective, from a leadership perspective, it is really bad business if so many in your organization are worried about whether they step outside of gender norms. That has nothing to do with the competences and what you're hired to do. So for me, it's so important that we expand this in order for people to tap into the competencies they have. The amount of people that I talk to who are worried about overstepping these norms, it's massive. It is really stupid and bad for business that your employees are thinking about this. Okay? They should be thinking about problem solving. So if you don't belong to the norm in organizations, you spend a huge amount of time trying to fit in or realizing how your body might fit in. So that is my business case argument. And that is super, super, super important, because I do not mean that women don't bring something extra. They just don't bring something extra in and of their femininity. Okay? I'm usually not considered very feminine, if you take away my dresses. Good. So, I want to talk a little about the usual mistakes. Maybe I will go on with the negativity. I'm sorry. I am the killjoy. I embody it and I embrace it, okay? I will also turn to what we can do. But first, the biggest mistakes, because I really want organizations to stop doing many of these things. The first one is women initiatives, okay? And this does not mean that we should not do something for the women. And I talked to you about it before this event. But it means that inside an organization, if you have, for example, a woman's course in power and politics, or, by the way, salary negotiation, it doesn't matter if you have it here. If you have it inside an organization. So I've talked to organizations that have power and politics, strategic thinking, salary negotiations, etc., advertised only for women in the organization. What do you reinforce? The stereotype that we are not good at this, okay? If you have women initiatives in some organizations without strategic backup, I have worked with organizations where the network was called, I'm swearing again, it's really, really an ugly word, I'm sorry, but it's called Fisseklubben, okay? I can't even say it in English, it's the C word. So, the C word club, okay? It is really not nice. And there is so much research done on how, even though these courses are brilliant, okay, how there is envy, anger, intolerance, bullying, etc. around this. So what I usually tell the directions, or the group of directors that I work with, send them on an MBA, okay? I teach MBA. I have 90% men in my MBA classes. Or do courses and make sure that you have 50% women there. Because if I talk to the same organizations, quite often, their talent programs do not have 50-50. Okay? So I have talent programs where I have 50-50. And I know this is a huge discussion, and I usually discuss this a lot with various people. Then if you're as old as I am, I hope you don't remember this book. If you don't, I'll be happy, but I think you do. Women are from Venus and men are from Mars. Okay? Yes. Okay, I can throw up, so horribly tired am I of this book and what comes after it. I can still sit at CBS's yearly party and the person next to me would go, but that is just because they're different, or the fetus thing, or the intelligence thing, or something else. Okay? So we need to park this. Yes, men and women are different from each other, but women are different from women. Men are different from men. And you guys, with leadership aspirations, have so much more in common, men and women, than you do with a woman or a man somewhere else. So what I usually tell the organizations that try to use this as an explanation, if when you hire people into your organization, you have so much cultural control over who you hire, that the people who are attracted to Novo Nordisk or Maersk or whatever it is, well, they all have one thing in common, and that is that they are a Novo Nordisk person or an IBMer or something, because you identify so deeply with the organization that you work for. Next one. Avoid a helping discourse. I think I've said that. The Danish Ministry for Equality and all the other stuff that's in this bin of garbage together, fishing and food and Nordic collaboration and whatever. You never know what the minister is talking about, fishing quotas or whatever it is he talks about. Anyways, so the ministry made this initiative for best cases 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. In 8 of the 10, they start with a helping discourse. Women just need a little help. It's my job to help them become more secure. It's my job to help them. It's like, seriously? Are we still in the 80s where women need help in order to think? Get that out. We don't get anywhere with a helping discourse except for the fact that we reinforce the stereotype that women can't do this on their own. It does not mean that women shouldn't help each other, obviously, but it's not something a male CEO should write in a strategy document. Good. Meritocracy is an illusion. I have said that, and I will say it over and over again. It's an illusion. We cannot do that. We need help. Diversity does not come only from a good heart. It's great with people who want this, but we need this tied up to the strategic programs. We need this tied up to KPIs. We need this tied up to bonuses. We need this to be much higher prioritized than it is now. Work-life balance is not just for women with children. Work-life balance is definitely also for men, because last time I checked, men got children as well. And last time I checked, particularly the young men really want paternity leave. If you were an older audience, I would also have asked you, how many of you have children or do not have children? And there's usually a couple of people who raise their hands. And then I asked them, so you don't want a life, do you? Okay? Because the work-life balance is only for the particular women with children. Okay? You don't need that. You don't have anything meaningful in your life. Obviously, that's not true. Fake news. So many organizations and so much of the public debate about diversity, in particular about women, is based on gut feeling. Okay? Everyone has an opinion about this. So every time I discuss this in board of directors or in kind of boardrooms, people will go, oh yeah, but my wife, or something like that. Or, but it's not my experience. Or, but I've never experienced sexual harassment, so it can't be a problem. Okay? This has nothing to do about you in singular. It has everything to do about us. Okay? You would never say that if you discuss the financial strategy of the firm. Well, it's not my opinion at home when I do my shopping that it's. You would never do that. Okay? So we need to get our facts straight. How many women are ambitious? It's often assumed that they're not. Last time I made analysis about among CBS students and CBS alumni, exactly the same level of ambition. Okay? So we have to stop that and get our facts straight. The other one is gender pay gap. Most organizations I talk to, we don't have that here. That's not here. I know we pay them the same. Why? How? Can you show me the numbers? No, I just know. No, you don't. Okay? If you're the only company in Denmark that actually does pay your employees equal, you want to know because you want to brand yourself on this. Okay? So get your facts straight. Don't fix the women. We have talked about this. Please don't fix the women. Fix the system. Women should not lean in. And this is particularly important to this audience. I always get the question, so what should we do? I don't want to answer it because it's not your responsibility. It might be your responsibility as a group to do something, but not as an individual. It's not your responsibility to lean more in, be more assertive, ask for more, because then you'll just be called a bitch. Okay, now I'm getting excited. Anyway, oh, this was nice to have an audience. I was doing an online thing this morning and nobody laughs at my joke. So women should not lean in. I mean, I'm pretty sure that book has done great things for many women, but it has also done a lot of bad things because it has put the responsibility on the individual, just like stress and work-life balance and everything else. So we have a society where it's our responsibility as an employee to fix our work. Don't mix up diversity and inclusion. Super important. Diversity is what we can count. Okay? And we need to count certain things, but we can only count gender, nationality, and age in a Danish context. As I usually say, I'm not Danish. You've heard my Danish. I can pronounce fy for helvede very well. Okay? So people go, why? That's interesting. I never thought about that. No, that's because I'm white. Okay? So it is so... Now I forgot my point. Yo, that's inclusion. So I count in the statistics over internationals. But nobody... Where are you from? Yeah, where are you from? Sorry. Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? I'm Austrian. Okay? And that is only because I am born back in the days, oh now I get into storytelling, when it was such a patriarchal society that Denmark didn't give citizenship if your mother was Danish. It's not good enough. Okay? So I'm Austrian because my mother is Danish, my dad is Austrian. I speak horribly German, but I have to go to the embassy every year and go, ich möchte gerne ein neuer Reisenpass, bitte. That's why my youngest son is Finnish, because his dad is Finnish, and really puts layers to my categories here. So his dad is Finnish, and when he was 6 weeks old, not the dad, obviously, the son, I needed a passport for him, and I just couldn't go to the Austrian embassy. I had no idea how to speak German after 6 weeks. So I went to the Finnish one, because they speak Swedish. Super practical. Because the Swedish minority, the Swedish-speaking white minority is so important, even though it's only 6%, that are double languages everywhere. Gets you thinking about what minority is important. Good. What can be done? And I know I'm running out of time. I'll be 4 minutes late. Yeah. So what can be done? We can fix culture, or we can fix behavior. I think we should work on both. It is super difficult to fix culture, as anyone who's ever tried that. Right now at CBS, we are in the middle of a strategy process. So if you ask management here, ask them how easy it is to implement a strategy. Ask anyone who has written a new strategy or tried to change culture how easy that is. People are generally change resistant. Okay, they hate change. But of course it can be done. But it's much easier to start in the small and start with behavior and what I call bias blockers. Because if you look at all the bias that you have in organizations, there are tiny little things which are very easy to do. And I know that you might not be in the positions now to do this, but as soon as you are in a job somewhere, you can place demands or at least ask for these things because they're cheap and they're efficient. And as one of my favorite Harvard Business Review articles says, it's much easier to change behavior than to change the minds of people. So, what can you do? You can advertise the positions. I talked about this already. It is scarily few particular leadership jobs. management jobs that are even advertised. You can consider language in your job ads. And no, I'm not saying that if you write empathy and female words and stuff like that, women will apply. No, I'm saying that because of the ballerina problem, we know that many women know that they're punished for wanting too much, which means studies shows that if you are very precise in listing what competences you need covered, more women apply. Okay? So more women apply if they know exactly what's expected of them. Not if it says, we value human, whatever. Okay? So, anonymize and depersonalize applications. We have absolutely no need for pictures. I also teased you a little bit about your pictures online. But we have it's fine to have pictures online, but we have no need for pictures in an application. How many of you think it's really nice to put a picture on an application? Do you like it? No? Jesus, I've never seen that before. Okay, so usually people would go, it's not very nice to choose the picture to put on an application. No, okay, so it was the opposite. It was the... But you have to, look professional, but not too much, not too stiff, not too much makeup, not too little, the right clothes. By the way, you are all in black and white. Almost. So, and I'm getting out of limb. I was not supposed to go there. But the point here is, we don't need it. I worked with an organization recently, and after I said this, one of the managers actually raised... It was a man, but that doesn't make a difference. But he raised his hand and said, okay, this really makes me think, because last time I went through a pool of applications, I did the first sorting based on picture. Based on picture, okay? Because they get so many. So I understand, in a sense, why you would do that. So we don't need picture, we don't need name, we don't need place of birth, we don't need nationality, we don't need where your education is from, etc. in the first screening. And then I usually tell managers, then if a different body than you expected walks in the door, you can use that to kind of go, okay, what does this tell me about my gut feeling? Which is such a good kind of side effect of this. So we don't need any of this. You can even use an application form. I don't know whether you noticed, but at graduation times here at CBS, in the bathrooms, not that I spend too much time in the bathroom, when you go to the bathrooms at CBS around graduation time, there will be ads where you can buy a CV. Not a fake CV, but you can pay someone to put it up nicely, okay? You can also pay someone to write your application. What does that produce? People with money can write a good application, okay? And as I talk to the recruiters quite often, would you really not like being, get rid of all the blah, 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 blah. I am very good at this. And it doesn't feel good to write it either. And we also know from bias research that women have more difficult time doing that. We don't need that information to begin with. Use a diverse hiring committee. That's not rocket science, but I also always tell people to divide the interview into several rounds so that you're only interviewed by one person. How many of you have been to a job interview? That's probably all of you, right? How many of them was there more than one person in front of you? Yeah, many of them. It's not only corona that's infectious. And you're about to sneeze. That was really good timing. We have timed this. It's not only corona that's infectious. Bias is as well. Okay? So if you sit an interview panel, then if I start saying something and my boss is next to me, or my boss starts saying something and I'm next to him or her, that infects the conversation, influences the conversation is a better word. So divide it, okay? So as soon as you get out there, make sure you divide the interviews. Use and place demands to headhunters, okay? Recently, and this is my last anecdote, recently I gave this speech to a consulting firm, and after the speech, a partner came up to me and he said, Oh, it's my second to last anecdote. And he said to me, it really made me think what you said, and I'm of course happy that that happened, but what he said was, recently, another office, not the Danish office, they needed more female partners, okay? So they hired a headhunting firm to find a lot of candidates. What happened was that they found 20 candidates, and they started a really rigid process. How many of these women do you think got hired? 0, okay? Because they didn't live up to the requirements. Okay? They didn't live up to the required qualifications. And everyone thought, oh, that was too bad. Again, there are no qualified women, we can't find them anywhere. Okay? Until he realized that none of the male partners would be living up to the same requirements. But they were not hired that way. They were hired in a taxi, or even in a sauna, or somewhere else. Okay? So it doesn't necessarily help to use headhunters. You have 1 to place demands on headhunters, and you have 2 not only to ask headhunters for female candidates, or to do the processes when you want women. The last one is soft quotas. So I know quotas is, there are 2 words in the Danish debate that can make people go completely berserk. And this is one of them. But it's important with the soft in front of it. But 2 words, quotas and feminist, really make people angry. Okay? But soft quotas, I'm actually beginning to persuade many organizations to do that. It's super smart. Okay? If you have a list of competencies, you have a threshold, you know exactly what competencies you need to fill out this position. If people are above that, take the one of the underrepresented. Gender, race, whatever. Sexuality, you can't do that because you can't see it. I could make a joke about that. No, don't. We can talk about that in the questions afterwards. But it's super, super easy, okay, to just go soft quota. Because then you can't claim the person is not qualified. You can't claim that you're compromising with competencies. We are already compromising with competencies because we can't do this on our own. Okay? So there's so much positivity, so much branding, so much money to bring in if you apply the soft quotas. That will be my last word, because otherwise I'll just keep on talking.